Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's lunchtime conversation, as part of Invisible Dust's talk series. For today's session, we're going to be focusing on how can nature help us thrive? And to have that conversation, we're joined by Frances Disley, Dr. Emma Lawrence, and Elizabeth Wathuti. Before we go to our guests joining us today, I'll introduce myself. I'm Bianca Manu, a Ghanaian British curator, producer, and writer. And I'm wearing a headscarf wrap, a white t-shirt with a background of palm trees. And just before we go into our discussion, each of our guests will be giving a brief description of themselves. And I'd like to start with Frances, please.
So I'm Frances Disley. I'm a white woman in my 50s with blonde short hair with a white top.
Thanks, Frances. Over to Emma Lawrence.
Thanks, Bianca. I'm a white woman, Australian, in my 30s, and I'm wearing a green top with an orangey jumper.
And last but not least, Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Wathuti, an environmentalist and climate activist from Kenya, and also really passionate about nature, and currently the founder of Green Generation Initiative and the head of campaigns at Wangari Maathai Foundation, and plated black on my hair and a grey top. Good to meet you all.
Thank you all for that introduction. So to frame today's conversation, we're really wanting to look at and discuss the connection between nature that we have. We all acknowledge growing, and it's becoming more and more apparent that nature is good for us. And it's something that for some of us, we lose throughout our lifetime. So I'd actually like to start with a quote from Frances's film, where she says, "I wanted to say you've been with me since I was a kid." It's a simple line of poetry that reminds us of where it starts, something that's always been around us that we take for granted, and it's part of our well-being. And another thing that Frances says, which is really beautifully put, is that nature gives us a sense of awe and inspiration. So these are the elements and emotions that I'd like to ground today's conversation with. And to begin, for the audience, because we will be taking a poll, I'd like to ask you, do you feel more or less connected to nature than you did 5 years ago? Just to get you into that headspace and think about how, as we grow, our relationship to nature changes also. And in the meantime, whilst you're answering that question, I'd like to start by giving each of our guests an opportunity to answer that question for us as well. How can nature help us thrive? And I'd like to start with Dr. Emma Lawrence, please. Emma is a mental health innovations fellow at Imperial College London, and she also co-founded the youth mental health charity It Gets Better, as well as Climate Cares. Over to you, Emma.
Thanks very much, Bianca. So how does nature help us thrive? I think it's such a big question, and something that probably everyone attending today and on the panel sort of anecdotally and sort of inherently feels, if we're sort of attending in this space, that connection to nature can create this sense of awe, wonder, meaningfulness, relaxation, recreation, pleasure, that can have then flow-on effects for our sort of mental health and our physical health. But we also see that in the data. So both in terms of our connection to nature, so the connection we feel with nature is linked with a range of benefits, including things like how much meaning we feel in life, our sense of life satisfaction and vitality, and also mental and physical health benefits. So it's been shown to help with treatment of anxiety and depression, with general sort of well-being in the population, and with reduced things like cardiovascular disease, improved even diabetes outcomes. So it's really sort of across a huge array of measures. But as well as that connection to nature, it's about time spent in nature that's meaningful. So we can feel a connection with nature whether or not we're spending time in nature, but also, you know, the time we spend in nature and in particularly consciously thinking or having emotional reflections, connections within that green space, within that nature time is particularly important. So it's good to spend time in green space. It's good to spend time in nature, but also when we do that with activities or ways where we're really noticing what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're feeling, that leads to even more benefit. So basically there's a huge amount of evidence and sort of growing all the time the benefits that nature gives us. And I think that basically fundamentally comes from the fact that we are a part of nature, we shouldn't be apart from nature. And we see that in the fact that we as humans tend to seek out and derive pleasure from things that look natural, this sort of biophilia hypothesis. So it's sort of hardwired into us in a way to seek that out. And yeah, I'll stop there for now, but I'm sure that others will build on that. But yeah, the evidence is very clear. And I think exploring today, what we do with that knowledge from both the science and also our own experiences in our society now, where maybe we have less opportunity to connect with nature than we did in the past.
Thanks, Emma. And we'll come back to you on that whilst we're getting some more poll questions. I wanted to head over to Elizabeth and ask you about your perspective on that, about nature, especially being in Kenya. So, for example, I spent part of the year in Ghana, and when I'm there, my relationship to nature is completely different. So I wanted to know for you how it is in your context right now, especially with your background of green leaves and trees. Elizabeth, if you could just unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. It would be great to first mention that the picture you see in my background, that's the forest that I visit almost every other weekend. It's Karura Forest here in Kenya, and also really famous because the late Professor Wangari Maathai was one of the African environmentalists who really fought so hard to protect this forest that my generation can now enjoy. And for me, I had an opportunity to grow up in nature and in one of the most forested regions in Kenya. And this region really made me love nature and connect to nature at a young age. And I remember as a child, the memories were more of the trees that were ahead of me, the bushes besides me, the clean streams and rivers that were flowing close to my homestead. And all of these memories really made me have a strong love for nature. And I do believe that everything that humanity has ever needed to thrive and survive has been provided for by nature. And that is why, in return, as the entire human race, we need to do everything that is possible to also help nature thrive on the other hand. And for me, I think one of the really things that continue to help me get much connected to the natural world is the fact that I also got opportunities to co-create with nature, like an opportunity to plant my first tree when I was only 7. And this was a chance to experience how it meant seeing a tree growing and what it meant to actually plant a tree in a place where I would get all the benefits that were coming from nature in this particular forest. But at the end of the day, really finding and being able to experience ecological grief along the way, because at one point in time, I visited this hill where I planted my first tree when I was 7, and I went there to actually check how my tree was thriving. Was it doing well? Did it add to the beauty of the forest? And to my surprise, I found so many logs and tree stumps close to this hill that I always loved to stay in, and close to this hill that I always loved to visit every time and just enjoy the fresh air and enjoy all the great benefits that do come with nature. And of course, it was heartbreaking to even wonder why someone would really interfere with such a beautiful ecosystem that keeps, the quality of air very high, and also keeps the environment beautiful at the same time. So these are some of the things that really also, gave me a hunger to want to do something about conservation and about nature. And I do believe that nature helps us thrive every other day, because this is about the air that we breathe. It's about the food that we eat every day. It's about the bird songs that we listen to every other day. And even right now, when we are in the middle of a pandemic, we're seeing more and more people are moving into green spaces and out in nature, into the forests, to find peace. And in places where we are expected to like social distance, and when there are lockdowns, people are moving to nature to really find and, you know, improve on their mental health and find some peace of mind as well. So we can never underestimate the value that nature has to help humanity thrive and survive at the same time.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was a really passionate start and introduction. We'll come back to you to hear a bit more about that. I'd like to ask Frances now about that same question, from Elizabeth's kind of real immersion in nature, so go from lived experience to political. Can you tell me a bit more for you, Frances, from a personal perspective or even as an artist as well?
Yeah, just like jumping off from something that Emma said, it's kind of like, it feels like we need to make a distinction between us and, like, I think the word nature sometimes is kind of problematic because it really oversimplifies, and it makes it kind of, it endorses the notion that it's us and that, you know, like, so it kind of sits us like quite high up, it sits us at the top of that kind of pile. So I'm interested in how we can sort of start to think about, like, and Elizabeth said, like, collaborating with plants as well, and seeing it as like a what can we get from these, you know, what have we done to them, what do we need to do, like, I'm interested in how we can build like a personal relationship with individual plants, so that we treat them in a way that we would our family and our friends, and see ourselves as part of that community, just a little part of that community that has this sort of like huge effect and huge impact. And I think if people can start to see that, like, immediately their community gets bigger, their family gets bigger, you know, they become part of this. And I think, so for me, that feels like a really sort of liberating notion, and I think your own insignificance in that can actually be a real relief. And I've been thinking quite a lot lately around what we perceive here locally as weeds, and how these the sort of the healing plants that work well with the human body just keep coming back, and they keep growing in the cracks, and where we've sort of disturbed the soil, and coming back to kind of send us a message that they want to work with us, and they keep turning up for us when we keep screwing things up. So I'm interested in how these little weeds can become our friends, and we can see them. And also, for me, that's exciting because you know, not everyone can have a garden, not everyone can have access to this space. But if we look at the things that happen when the local council hasn't weed killed, you know, and we start to appreciate the little plants that grow in urban environments, then it, you know, it doesn't feel like it's other, because I think sometimes nature in England can feel like it's exclusive, you know, and not for everyone. So yeah, that's kind of a bit of my response.
Actually, and Frances, it would be nice to get into the discussion and start with you. So one of the things that you've just talked about is how nature, or access to nature, can be quite exclusive. Can you talk about how in the recent work you've done as part of Unnatural, you really look at neutral spaces, park spaces, can become a place for everyone to enjoy and have access to nature, regardless of, you know, your social status or class?
Yeah, so like I've become like totally seduced by the local municipal park, and I'm starting a herbalism journey. So I've started to like become interested in medicinal plants. So I've had a different like viewpoint in terms of noticing, and started to really like recognize and acknowledge all of these things that are everywhere, particularly with medicinal like plants that are kind of helpful to humans. They are everywhere, and they are in these kind of waste grounds. And I've been taking my kids along to particularly in lockdown, like the anxiety for most people was kind of escalating understandably last year, and my go-to has always been to grow and plants, and I had like a bad patch of anxiety a couple of years ago when I just started growing things, and that was my sort of healing space. But it feels like everybody's potentially open to that conversation at the moment. It feels like a really sponge-like time to get people to potentially value and reflect on what those in-between spaces have kind of offered for people lately. And like there's loads of no-mo initiatives going on with councils and stuff, and it feels like things are having a bit of breathing space. So I think it's those spaces that aren't personal gardens. I live in Liverpool city centre. We're all in like little terrace back-to-backs. So, you know, you have to go quite far to get like your own little patch of green space. And it feels like those overlooked spaces, people really valuing when they had their like the restrictions really early on about like your limitation of space. Yeah, so I kind of feel like it's a moment to kind of like just switch the value with that. And the thing with weeds as well is they don't have the same monetary value because they can't be controlled. So people just don't see them because they don't fit in with our economic system. But I think if we could flip that, then it would really radically like shift people's access to that. And like, you know, if you're not looking at something, if you think that you are only experiencing nature when it's something that's really sort of controlled by humans and our cultural perception of what is beautiful in terms of like flora and fauna, then, you know, everybody, it just kind of, it frees up that experience for way more people.
I'm having trouble hearing Bianca, so I might just pick up on that those points. So, I mean, there's quite a lot there, I think, already to unpack from everything that Elizabeth and Francis just said, which is really wonderful. There's obviously such a rich topic. I think that point about language is so important. This idea of, you know, what are we talking about? Because you know, there is the nature as an experience of time in wilderness. There is nature as that experience of noticing sort of everyday, you know, moss on the windowsill when you go out to take your bins out, or you know, a bird flying past your window in lockdown and chirping, and those little everyday moments that people talk about. And then there's this sort of bigger overarching concept that we all kind of know, or mostly know, but don't really explicitly think about that much, maybe, that we are fundamentally reliant on these natural systems. And we sort of learn at some point in school, I guess, about these different, you know, cycles of, you know, the water cycle and the air cycle, and the fact that the molecules that are in my lungs now get breathed out and travel around the world, and some of them stay in this room, and some of them we breathed in by some other animal, and that you know, that the air we breathe depends on the trees, and that these cycles are all interlinked in fundamental ways. And so our lives are inherently dependent on these fundamental natural cycles that we are inherently part of, no matter how much we try and get away from them, or no matter how much as a species we've overexploited and sort of shifted the balance. You know, we're realizing, I guess, in the climate and ecological crises more and more that we are part of those cycles, and we are constrained by those systems. And so, as well as our emotional connection to nature, which can vary from person to person, I think, you know, as a society, we are all part of these cycles fundamentally, but recognizing that can come with wonderful opportunities, I think, for this sense of awe and for this sense of connection to something bigger than us, as Frances said. So I think we see that people can derive a lot of meaning, a lot of satisfaction, a lot of meaning making from this understanding of, we're not just, us, as that we are inherently part of these systems, part of even the bacteria, within us, outnumbering our own human cells. So those understandings and those realizations about our place in these cycles, and in this bigger picture, can come with a lot of meaning and help our own sort of connections to each other, which are then very rich and rewarding for our own lives and our own mental health. And fostering that, I think, can come with these greater experiences of noticing these everyday moments of connection to the other living things around us, as Frances was also describing. And we see that in interventions that have worked for 30 days, just getting people to notice with their different senses the nature that they can sort of see around them. And that can have long-term implications for their health, and also for their willingness and desire to take actions to protect it and help nature. And I personally have been super lucky to have grown up surrounded by bushland in the Adelaide Hills, and that space still is where I sort of feel most at home and most grounded and most connected. So my own experiences really drive me. But for people who haven't had those experiences, I think there's still, to be surrounded by wilderness, there's still nature all around us where we can notice and we can appreciate. And this is being taken up actually by the NHS. So they're now recognizing the benefits of green prescribing. And there's like £5.8 million given last year for a couple of years to look at prescribing people with opportunities to spend time in nature and with each other in certain programs. And this seems particularly good for marginalized groups, who the data shows are less likely to have access to green space, and where, if you survey kids, like 8 out of 10 in a survey last year from the government, so they felt very happy spending time in green space and nature, and that didn't matter what ethnicity or background or how much money their family had. But then when you looked at how much access those children actually had and time that they were spending in nature, particularly in lockdowns or in green space, that really did depend on what their background was. And so, that is an area where there are real inequalities that need addressing.
Thanks, Emma, and sorry for the slight disruption. I'd like to pick up on your point of kind of looking at, there's lots of different ways to get people to be more mobilized about nature. And one of the ways that I'd like to invite another perspective is to ask Elizabeth to talk a bit more about having nature all around her, to go from something that is in your everyday lived experience and then becoming very actively political about it. Your work ranges from being a UN Youth Champion of the Earth and an environmentalist and an activist. Could you tell us a bit more about that experience from when you were 7 and going back to find the tree that you planted didn't exist, how it mobilized you?
Yeah, I would say that my strong connection with the natural world and just being able to grow up in this place where I would directly connect to nature also gave me a natural call to action. And that is why at this point in time, when I visited this hill to check on my tree, and what I found were tree logs, I actually felt so angry and heartbroken at the same time. But what really made a difference is the fact that this anger gave me a hunger to want to do something about challenges like deforestation and challenges where a lot of people continue to harm nature every other time. And that is what really resonates with everything that I'm doing today, because a lot of times we get angry and we get frustrated about what is happening to our natural world, but we stop at that. We just stop at the reactions, but we are not proactive enough to take up action with the little thing that we can do from our own communities, from our own surroundings. And for me, that's one step that I decided to do, that because I have this burden. And I think it also reminds me of a quote that Professor Ngare Maathai always mentioned, that those of us who understand and feel strongly must not tire, and we must not give up, because the burden is on us who know, and those who don't know are at peace. So we are the ones who know that get disturbed and are caused to take action. So I really take this particular quote so seriously, because when you have that burden and then you don't do anything about it, it means that no one else is going to really step up and take action on nature. And so for me, that's how I also ended up being an environmentalist and a climate activist. And I also founded an initiative to make sure that more children would get connected to nature at a young age, and also in the process create a generation of environmentally conscious individuals. So I decided to found a Green Generation Initiative to make sure that many other young people would grow up with the same connection with nature, and at the same time they would develop a natural call to action. And this is where we say that their collective action will definitely help mobilize most of the actions that we are talking about today, the actions on climate change, action on deforestation, every issue that we are facing today. And it all has to start from somewhere. So along the way, we also discovered that not everyone has got that privilege to have grown up in a place that actually is green, forested. Some people have grown up in the cities. Others have grown up in places, they are not cities, but they are places where there's not even a single tree, and they have to go through the worst impacts of climate change, from the droughts, the acute water shortages, hunger, all of these issues. And there's nothing that they can look aside or forward and, call nature, because all they see maybe is the dry lands and all of these things. So this initiative, we decided to begin a campaign that we dubbed Adopt a Tree campaign, to make sure that every child in every school in my country would get a chance to plant and adopt a tree each in their school compound. And of course, this is in a way to protect nature, and at the same time to help them have that connection with the natural world by actually participating and being part of the solution to address some of the most pressing issues of our time, like the climate crisis. And also we discovered that nature can also help us address these issues, because some of the children that we were planting trees with, we could discover that maybe some of them had challenges also to do with food. And so we decided to begin planting trees that would actually address the food insecurity issue. And this is where we started to now start up food forests by picking a designated corner in the school compound and planting mixed species of fruit trees. And then these fruits would provide a nutritious source of food for the children to eat at the end of the day. And also the fruit in itself is a nature aspect that would connect any child all around the world to nature, and to understand that nature is more than just the trees that we see. Nature is more of the food that we eat, the air that we breathe every day. And these are the things that we try to really make the children understand. And so we've also been greening schools, because our main focus has been on schools that are less privileged, schools that have all the challenges, like I've mentioned, the aspect that children do not have maybe even a single tree in the school compound or flowers that they can look up to and say that this is nature and we love nature. So we've been trying to green these schools, and of course through even starting up green fences, where we just fence up the school compound with trees. And I think for my country, most of the schools, if you want to know what the landmark is, it's always surrounded by trees as the fence. And the other thing is to also make sure that they have different aspects that really make them, get to love nature every other time, including plants in their classrooms, especially if they're in the cities. And this is how we continue to shape the narrative and change the narrative about making sure that the entire human race is connected to nature, and that we continue to help nature thrive. Over to you, Bianca.
Elizabeth, that was really inspiring to hear everything you just said. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sorry, I'm having serious local Wi-Fi issues. It's probably a sign I should be in nature right now. That was really great to hear you say so much about the work that you're doing and for it to be so active and activated. Now, one of the things that I'd probably like to shift to is a bit more of the context that Francis and Emma are working in, where sometimes people don't even realize that nature's been removed from them or there's an absence of it. And it's actually the sense of, so the emotions aren't always as strong. There isn't always as much an understanding that you should be angry that you don't have access to nature. Nature is something that's over there. Maybe Francis, before I come back to Emma's point about the work that she's doing, could you talk about that, like how nature is othered and how people don't even realize that this is something that is so essential and integral to their well-being?
Yeah, I was just thinking the other day about like, you know, in the urban environment, like we kind of assume that concrete and tarmac are like our surfaces, like that's, you know, that's kind of like, and then gardens and green spaces, it's as if psychologically we think they sit on top, as if, you know, like the hierarchy's all kind of messed up with that. But if we just lifted it up like that, you know, I kind of feel like also there's like an exclusivity around horticulture and gardens and plants that's to do with like, you know, people can feel like that's not their domain because they don't know the kind of botanical names of things, and like, I'm not green-fingered, I'm green-fingered, you know. If you can't grow a houseplant, it's mainly because it's not native to this country and it's not supposed to be living in the UK in your house, so it means nothing. I kind of feel like maybe I think sometimes people feel excluded and they give up, and then they grow up feeling like, you know, they're not part of that, so they've kind of given up on it, and maybe just, like I said before, the value system kind of needs to shift. I'm doing a residency at the moment with airspace in the Spode Rose Garden in the centre of Stoke, and I'm growing this medicinal bed. It's a public park. It's a lovely place where people kind of, you know, anyone can come and take part in it. And I just went to the brownfield site around the back, which is kind of just been left for a year, and it's full of St. John's wort and mugwort and all of these things. And when we talk about like access to nature, maybe there's these like, you know, it's, if we could value the spaces that aren't formal parks and gardens and things like that, I think that people could still get that experience and it be a valid thing. We just kind of need to shift the hierarchy in all of that somehow.
So you keep talking about shifting hierarchies. Before I pick up that point, it'd probably be a good time now to visit the polls to see what the feedback was from the audience members. So the response is 65% say they feel more connected to nature than they did 5 years ago. Thank you for that. You're welcome, audience members, please, to add your comments in the chat and we'll pick up on that and include it, weave it into this conversation. So back to Francis and talking about shifting the status quo and hierarchy. I think something that you've mentioned as well as Elizabeth is the importance of showing nature for function. If we're not at the very least going to appreciate it for the environmental impact it has for our mental health and well-being, then maybe with function, like with Elizabeth, with planting trees and getting young people to know the importance of fruit and trees and nature and plants as a form of sustenance. And Francis, you're talking about the fact that you come across St. John's wort or plants in our everyday that are part of our kind of our health, our physical health in a time when we need it more and more. Emma, could you tell us a bit about how, you know, from your perspective, how function works? What does that mean for you in your context in relation to nature?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I guess, and just to say that I'm not an expert in the sort of psychology of relationship between us and nature, unfortunately, but I work with many people who do, but I do work in climate change and mental health more specifically. So a lot of the time I'm also looking at how people are grappling with difficult emotions related to the climate and ecological crises. But a lot of those difficult emotions that, as Elizabeth spoke to before, around sort of anger and grief and loss, they come fundamentally from this connection that we have with nature. And so people are talking about this idea of sort of eco-empathy for these sort of these different emotions people are feeling in response to loss and change of these environments and these systems, and how those emotions can also drive people to action, which can then also provide benefits to health and well-being. So I think within that context of the climate and ecological crises, we're fundamentally both seeing how we are dependent on these systems for the function of safe climate, for safe sort of future for us. Even with things like COVID, we're seeing how, you know, something that originated in animals or other animal species, non-human animal species, can cross into us and have impacts. We're seeing the connection with us and nature in these, or how we're part of nature in these sort of fundamental ways. So we can see function within that setting, but we can also see it within the more, what does it give us for sustenance, sustaining us, but also what is the function, as you said, from more a you know, a life meaning making, mental health, emotional well-being perspective, and you know, a recreation perspective. So there's many functions, and so people who work in this area kind of look at this kind of you know, trying to put a price on all of the services that the ecological systems or green spaces provide us, and there are many, and basically we undervalue them in our economic systems, in our culture, in our societies, and often as individuals. And I'm hoping, though, that we're starting to see a shift across all of those things, a shift in how we see, you know, the importance of protecting nature just for us to survive as humans, but also the importance for our own well-being, our recreation, our quality of life. And that is where, you know, I think that people are saying in the poll, no one said they feel less connected to nature than 5 years ago, and 65% said more. That's really interesting in the context of being kind of locked away a lot of the time over the last year or so. So what is it that has shifted over that time? And is it that, you know, we've been had time to start to notice things more in our local environments and feel more connected to urban nature within, even if you've been stuck in London, and maybe you would have spent an equal amount of time in green space or nature before, and maybe traveled to more exotic wild or spaces. Are you actually noticing the birds more in your own backyard because you're, you know, working from home and looking out the window and seeing those cycles change, you know, over the course of a year, when you're looking actually at probably maybe less diverse and different environments, but really noticing more and taking time to appreciate more of those local contexts. And so we are seeing in general that people are you know, really appreciating their local green spaces and wanting more biodiversity, more support for their local green spaces over the pandemic. So I hope that there is starting to be this shift in our understanding of the multiple benefits and services provided. And so of course they give us these benefits, and then there's the argument they're inherently valuable for their own sake. And I guess that comes back to this idea of hierarchies of where we sit as, you know, is the other animals, other creatures, other plants, they only have value insofar as they have value to us, or are they inherently valuable for their own sake, which opens up a lot of questions, I think, within even what drives conservation a lot of the time. And we see this discrepancy between different species being valued for being cute or not, or these ideas of like conservation through hunting. So I think there's a lot around that as well, of what it means, you know, to value nature or to feel connected to nature. I'll stop for now. I actually have one other story I wanted to share, but maybe I'll come back to it later because I think I've spoken for quite a while now. And back to you, Bianca. Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
Thank you. Just to pick up on what you said about nature being inherently valuable, that's something that's very clear with Elizabeth's work in Kenya. And I think maybe with what you're doing and Francis, it's more about reminding people that this has always been there. This has always had its value. So the question for the audience as well to add comments in the chat is, you know, one of the things that you also mentioned, Emma, is the sense of what can we do more? What is the call to action here? How do we showcase that nature is more inherently valuable? And if anyone has any stories of their experiences, whether in lockdown or otherwise, that they'd like to share that I could read out, that would be really nice to hear. But back to actions in the way that Elizabeth had talked about so many different initiatives and it being about school. Francis, could you talk a bit about that as well, even with the parks and the projects that you've done with your video work? Who, with the communities that you work with, for example, or even your children, if they are involved in it?
Yeah, well, I'm working on other projects as well in a place called Lee in Wigan Borough, and there's a gallery there called Turnpike, and it's above the local library, and it's also the local council one-stop shop, and we've taken over all of the flower beds and we're putting medicinal plants in there, and it's going to become this like public garden that anyone can experience, and it'll have like, there's themed beds that are around first aid, like scents, teas, all this kind of stuff, and like making that sort of, it'll be like a, you know, an ongoing project, but it's like a, also I'll be there for a year, and it's just kind of like an opportunity to think about like those real genuine public spaces, and like showcasing plants that you wouldn't normally kind of showcase, and sitting them alongside other things, and it feels like it's a way on a really local level to test out these ideas of like whether you could lower someone's anxiety when they're walking into like the council buildings to deal with some like horrible kind of thing that they're having to deal with, like just kind of on the ground, sort of testing out whether you can kind of shift that space. I was thinking about, like, for me, I'm really interested in how on an individual level you actually create this bond and this relationship, how you get people on board with that, like how you get kids on board with that, how you get anyone on board with that, because it's like, it's a genuine thing to deal with. I think when you talk about a broader conversation, sometimes it's not, it's not like there's not an entry point for people. So I'm very interested in how we can like look at individual plants, develop that relationship, and then in theory, when you've kind of like held hands with those things, does that expand your perception, or can you deal with the greater question around like climate crisis? Yeah, I know, Emma, you work with young people thinking around like how that big conversation has a real impact on them, and maybe like they can feel kind of powerless, and maybe it's about this, like Elizabeth, allowing these people to plant these individual trees where they have like a literal physical kind of relationship with it. I think maybe working on that level, like, is how we actually expand upon that and make people feel like they can be empowered within that, and be kind of be active in the wider sort of conversation. Because I think sometimes, like, lots of people will just be, this is too big for me, like, oh, it's in the background, it's an anxiety, I can't do anything about it. And I think I'm really interested in like getting into the community and working with individuals, and like, running sessions where we look at the plants, or we talk about the plants, or we feel the plants, and we make medicines from the plants. Like, so it's this really like guided fostering a relationship with plant life, and then your vision of your local and the worldwide hopefully kind of shifts as a consequence of, like, because I am just dead interested in like that, but how do we really do it on a person to person kind of basis, and testing and trying those things out, like via my own wrestle with that myself, like, do I sit with a plant for a year and get to know it? Like, how does that work? Does that seem ridiculous to the majority of people? So what's the entry point? Is it talking to youth, young people about making things for their well-being, like things that they're familiar with that are about making a face cream or a balm or like a healing thing. And then if you do it yourself and you talk to the plant and you get from the plant, does that foster a new sort of richer relationship that kind of allows the wider conversation? Sorry, I probably went off on one there a bit.
No, it was good. I'm just before we go back to Emma to hear her little story that she mentioned, I'll go to the chat, and we have a comment from Sue Faye who says, hi, collecting seeds, swapping seeds, growing seeds, and understanding how to grow and handle plants inside and outside, nature as our mantra, and DIY survival at a local and domestic level. We now talk about going to the land, which is basically echoing what you've just said. And for example, Emma, before I come to you, even with the project you're doing at the moment in Lee, how are you making sure that the flower, these public flower beds that you're planting these medicinal plants inside of, how are you going to ensure that the legacy of that and that the local community, after you do the workshops, young people workshops, lives on, so people know that this is something they have to continue taking care of? It's not just a 1-year project or 2-year project.
It feels like an amazing opportunity, especially in the art world, to do something like that as well. So it's a live thing. And like working, as I have done with plants, I'm really interested in how it shows a parallel with the way we treat work and production of work. Like often people will work with plants on a short-term project and then it's kind of left, and like those living things that have been frilly for a moment kind of like die out and aren't cared for. So we're developing a group within the community. So they're going to lead a lot of this, and it'll be responsive. So the whole thing needs to be reactive and responsive. So whether it's so we are like running a weeding day where the chickweed gets made into something, and we'll just kind of just listen to people, develop a friends of, so that it becomes so the garden becomes welcomed and nurtured into the community. And like if some of it doesn't work, we shift it and change it. We think about like what we can gain from it, and then like what the community gets close to it, how they sort of communicate. So the friends group will be running workshops for the new members, like general public that are kind of passing. And there's so there'll be, and it's funny because you sit you go into gallery spaces with work that's stuck on the wall, and there's this barrier. It's like a threshold. Gallery spaces can feel really intimidating and alien, but like just working out the front on that bed, there's just so many people coming by and just saying, like I've got passion flower in my garden, and like I've not been sleeping lately. And you're like, wow, it's kind of relaxing, and it just feels like plants can be this amazing intermediary for like conversation. So I think all around like how we promoted the signage, all of this sort of stuff, and the information that we gather and the kind of armagnac that we're going to make over the year will be something that feels like the community can kind of feed into it. So all the workshops that are around it like will sort of be responsive, and it's an experiment. So like everything, like you grow everything, it might not work, but I'm hoping that like the mindset is to listen. So we're looking and listening and noticing, but with the community as well. So it feels like they don't feel like they're excluded. Running workshops where people rename the plants, so they're not, they kind of feel like they form a new relationship that's not based on everybody else's kind of prior ownership of those things as well. So it's definitely really important, and I think it's something that's overlooks, like symptomatic of lots of other kind of situations, I think.
Thanks, Frances. Just to let the audience know that we encourage you to please send any questions as well. And in the meantime, back to you, Emma. You've also shared this link about 30 random acts of wilderness, if you'd like to talk about that as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So I was just trying to build on this idea of, what are the ways, what are these kind of methods by which people are forging or trying to help forge these connections with nature. And it's like anything, I guess, everyone's different, and so there's there's been calls that it's been written about the importance of this diverse way of ways in, essentially, and that, you know, different people are going to find different activities, different things appealing, and different communities might have more or less access to some of these sort of opportunities or activities as well. And so I just put that link to 30 Days Wild as one example of an initiative encouraging everyone to try a bunch of different things for 30 days and sort of share different activities or different experiences. And that's actually been evaluated and has been shown by participating in that it really helped people's health and well-being and satisfaction, also into the future and into the actions that they would take to protect the environment. But I was involved last year with the Eden Project and on developing a proposal to try and do like a mass engagement across the country of connecting people with nature. And unfortunately, we just missed out on getting funding for it. So it won't be going ahead, but just the concept sort of still is important, this idea of different ways to engage communities. And so we had an amazing young poet, Isaiah Hull, who was coming up with sort of voices of nature that other people could add to. And we had ideas for sort of wild nights out where young people could come and kind of like get down and dirty when we'd have like, you know, different DJs and people kind of like doing guerrilla gardening in these different kind of empty allotments underneath billboards where there's usually just some waste space, and kind of having these areas kind of pop up with this kind of overnight gardening. So we were trying to think and trying to work with local groups and local communities of what makes sense for them. So I think that just with all of the work that I do is all about working with communities, no matter, you know, what project we're trying to work on. And so it's really important, the things that have been successful so far, to have that diversity of kind of ways in that make sense to people. And I guess I just wanted to also mention that fundamentally there's like a good news story here and a win-win opportunity, which Elizabeth also really spoke to, that even in my work, you know, working with this sort of mental health impacts of the climate and ecological crises, which are, you know, really big and underappreciated, there's opportunities as we build back from COVID, as we try and address climate change and the ecological crises, that the actions we need to take to protect nature or to create a safe climate can also have really big benefits for our mental health and for equality. So if we create more biodiverse green spaces that are more accessible, we can create cooler communities as well. So we reduce this sort of effect of urban heat, which can be more of an issue for people in sort of substandard housing or poorer communities where they don't have access to that green space. So we're helping protect from climate change and the effects of climate change, while also improving mental health and well-being, reduced air pollution. You know, there's kind of these win-win-wins. And the same with connecting with nature. So bringing communities into nature, as Frances said, it's not only about that connection with us as an individual person and that plant, it's about our connections with each other and how these things are very kind of community oriented often. So, you know, again, there's this kind of multiple benefits, as Elizabeth and Frances have both spoken to. And whenever you do one intervention or one working with communities, it's these multiplying benefits that we can start to see, and the opportunity we have to create that healthier future. So just very quickly, the story I wanted to say was when I spoke to Ed the first time, I don't know if everyone on the call knows, but this is from Invisible Dust. We both actually had recently found this song that I think is really lovely called The Lost Words Blessing. And it was written in response to this change in the Oxford Children's Dictionary, which is made for children 7 and up, where a lot of words around nature, so even things like, I think, acorn, and I'm trying to find it all now, but basic words around buttercups and frogs and things that were taken out of the dictionary because they weren't deemed as relevant anymore because people weren't spending as much time in nature. And words were put in like blog, broadband, chat room, voicemail. And so that they were deemed much more relevant to young people's lives now. And so in response response to these lost words, this group created this beautiful song called The Lost Words Blessing. But I just found that really quite striking, that, you know, words like fern or moss weren't considered relevant to children anymore, compared to something like chat room. So I think it comes back to Francis's original point about the power of language and the power of just equipping people with that feeling like this is a space for them, and that they have that language and those opportunities into connect in whatever way makes sense for them.
Wow, it'd be great if you could share that link in the chat if you have it somewhere. But I think, for example, what you've just said, that words are dying, not just the nature around us physically, but the language is dying, and with it the knowledge. Kind of compares very much to what Elizabeth has also said, in the sense that, for example, that Kenya is one of the fastest growing countries in Africa that's growing technologically. How will that relationship to nature change in the future, and will there be such a strong activist stronghold? We can only hope so. And just before I ask the final question, because we've got about a minute left, I just want to say thank you, so we can end with your final comments. Thank you to Ed and to Lydia as producers for this program, to Alice Sharp, and also to Invisible Dust for hosting Forecast, the new online program that brings together artists, scientists, and other thinkers to explore how we think about the future. I'd also like to invite everyone to join tomorrow for another lunchtime chat with Frances and Rebecca, a plant scientist at Kew, as they talk about Frances's recent work as part of Invisible Dust's Unnatural program. Thank you, Frances. Thank you, Emma. And thank you, Elizabeth. The final question to ask you as we end very briefly is to say, can we ever make peace with living in an urban environment? Thank you all for joining us today. Over to you, Elizabeth, to briefly answer this question, and then hand over to Emma and then Frances.
Thank you so much. Yes, we can truly find peace in urban environments, but we have to create that peace ourselves by making sure that we strike a balance between development that is happening in urban environments and our green spaces, because the green spaces in our urban environments are shrinking, and this definitely is not going to be something that we will want to look up to in the next, in the future. So we have to make sure that we create that peace, if we want to find that peace, by making sure that all our green spaces in the urban environments are well protected. And this is also going to call for us to stand up strongly, firmly for the right thing. And the right thing is to make sure that all our cities are green, clean, and resilient. And this is also very critical when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Emma, do you have any final comments before we hand over with Frances?
Yeah, sure. So just very quickly, I think it's probably personal, and it also depends on what we mean by an urban environment. I think we can imagine, we're just limited by creativity and imagination here, right? Which luckily humans often have plenty of. We can put that in the right direction. So, what is the urban environment of the future, and what does that look like to have an urban environment where lots of people are living close together, but those systems are sustainable and there's still biodiversity and access to that, where we're really part of nature and thriving alongside that within the urban environment. And it's also personal. I mean, I personally, much prefer to be in the Australian bushland than in a big city. Other people, really thrive in different environments. But as humans, we fundamentally have that capacity and desire in each of us to have that connection to something bigger, into the wider natural world. And so I hope that we foster that into the future of however we live as humans.
Thanks, Emma.
Sorry, it's really quite noisy here. I don't know whether you, but like, I think you can just, learn to love the urban environment by noticing and seeing and valuing, and then safeguarding, and then let those green spaces grow, and like just changing what you think is a green space, like conceptually, just will totally liberate you, and just understanding how all those plants are there to help, and just kind of noticing like the controls that we put upon them, like, yeah, the sort of our constant desire to gain personal credit from growing. It doesn't have to be that way. It kind of feels like we just need to back off a bit. I think back off, let things grow, and then safeguard them, like noticing like all of those little things that kind of keep coming back. Yeah.
Thank you, Frances. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, everyone. And on those final words, back off, let things grow. Wishing you all a stable, sound mind, good health, and thank you for joining. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.